Okay, number 14. We're here for week 9, our review, and just answering some student questions. So we're looking at number 14. And by the way, for those who are not here and are listening, we're just talking about how week 9 is a tough one. Things are getting tough in terms of keeping motivated and keeping going. So time management's challenging right now. Just know that you're in the home stretch. You're getting to the home stretch, but you can't slow down. That's what's happening for the next 6 weeks. You are seeing the end line, but you can't slow down because things are just happening and happening and happening. So just take a deep breath and do what you need to do to take care of yourself mentally and physically. That's usually means taking breaks throughout the day and moving your body, and also communicating with family and friends and making sure you're not feeling lonely. And we were talking about singing. I was talking about singing and drinking cups of tea and meditating and so forth. So, question was it number 14? This one, why do populations of endangered species often have low genetic variation?
Yeah, I had just written the bottleneck effects, but I wasn't sure if there was like more I should elaborate on for that one.
Yeah, it is the bottleneck effect in general. And then there are other things that happen. So the endangered species, right? Presumably at some point they had a large population size, maybe not the largest of population sizes, but the populations were reduced dramatically. And that's in this day and age, like right now, that's almost always due to some kind of human activity. A lot of times it has to do with habitat loss and hunting or harvesting, and they went down to very small numbers, and then conservation efforts kicked in and people said, hey, we're going to lose this. I mean, this applies to the California condor, it applies to black-footed ferrets, lots of species that are well known in North America as well as obviously across the world. And when they went through that bottleneck, it was a genetic bottleneck going from a large population to a very small population. They lost a large degree of genetic variation, so you're left with just a few individuals, and they don't have much genetic variation. It's just because of sampling error, right? If you just randomly take 9 individuals out of a group of 20,000 individuals, those 9 individuals are not going to have the same amount of genetic variation as that big group did. And so that happens. But then once you get through that bottleneck, genetic drift plays a large role. And why does genetic drift play a large role after a bottleneck? Genetic drift is much more likely to occur in a population that has gone through a bottleneck. Does anybody know why? Or what do we remember about genetic drift? Genetic drift is a tough one too. Is that something that you all understood?
Uh, Partially, yeah. But for the most part, it's pretty much like when something happens to the population and then the genetics of that population like kind of drift in one direction or the other. So when we were talking about snails and their shells,
Hmm.
there's like thick-shelled or thin-shelled. If something happens, such as a bottleneck, you might have a bunch of thick-shelled or only thin-shelled. You lose that variation in the genetics of that population. I don't know if that's accurate or if you have a clear way of explaining it.
Right. Well, so that could be a bottleneck if you had thinking about that big snail population and the wide variety of shell thicknesses in our Darwinian snails from lab. Yeah, if you were to randomly get rid of 90% of the snails in a big population, then you would have this bottleneck and you would have this random resulting genetic variation in the population. But then if you had this population of, let's say, 7 snails, why, if there's no selection and everything's just random, why might that population lose variation moving forward? What is it about that population that makes it more subject to the effects of randomness and chance and drift? Genetic drift affects what type of populations? What size populations? Just going to keep Does anybody know this one?
Isn't it small populations?
Yeah, small populations. So it's genetic drift is essentially sampling error, right? And if you have a small population, then they're not reproducing that much offspring because they're small. And that means that sampling error comes into play. So, one way to illustrate that is if you have a rhino of a certain rhino species and only one rhino in all the world has a certain rare allele, and that rhino reproduces 3 times and has 3 offspring. Is that rare allele going to end up in its offspring? We don't know, right? It might, but it has a certain chance of ending up in the offspring. And just due to randomness, it might not. And so because you have a small sample, if that rhino had 100 offspring, then you'd be pretty confident that that allele is going to make it into one of those offspring through random chance. But it's small populations. So the complete answer to this question, number 14, is that populations of endangered species have gone through a genetic bottleneck and lost variation, and now they are small. So small populations are at further risk of losing variation due to genetic drift. And once you lose an allele in a population, you don't get that allele back. Well, I can think of only 2 ways that you could possibly get that allele back. So here's another thought question and putting our information together from all of these lectures. Can you tell me if a population loses variation, 2 mechanisms through which they could get variation? If they lose an allele and it's gone. And I'm thinking about these potential causes of evolution in populations too. How do we get new alleles? What processes can introduce new alleles to a population? Anyone?
Mutations?
Mutation. Yes. So mutation. And mutation is random. So it's not like, oh, we lost that allele in the last generation, so now a mutation is going to happen and we're going to get that allele back. That's not how it happens. These are just mistakes. These are errors that are random. So it takes a long time to accumulate naturally occurring genetic variation through mutations. So once these populations go through that bottleneck and lose variation, their numbers might go back up, but then you're going to end up with a big population with low genetic variation. And besides mutation, there's one other way that a population can get a new allele. And I see where you're coming from, Joshua, with sexual reproduction, because sexual reproduction is a way of having variation, because it's about, let's see, this is part of this. How do you get variation in populations? Right? But sexual reproduction is about combining different, putting different traits in different combinations within an individual. But there's another way that you can get a new allele in a population. And I'm talking about populations here. So what were the 4 potential causes of evolution in populations? Let's go back to that one. Uh-oh. Oh, darn it. Hold on a sec here. Okay, I'm just pulling up my slides. But anyone know how you could get different alleles in a population?
Is it like the natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, and mutation?
And what's the other one that goes in there?
Oh, gene flow.
Yeah, it's gene flow. Yep, because gene flow would have an individual moving from one population to another population. So that individual might have a rare allele, an allele that's not present in the population it's moving to. So yeah, gene flow. And I know that's not on your review sheet, but this is just, I'm trying to get you all to think about these concepts and how they go together. And I'm going to pull up our slides for this week too. Okay, so how did you all do with, go back to this, so basically the lecture on population genetics was all about, I don't want that. It was all about the different ways that the different mechanisms that can lead to evolution in populations, right? So that's beyond natural selection, beyond sexual selection. We're just thinking about changes in allele frequencies from one generation to the next in a population. It's not always something that leads to that population being well adapted to the environment. So natural selection should lead to populations being well adapted to their, or at least better adapted to their environment, right? And sexual selection should lead not necessarily to better survival rates, but to more reproduction and a higher average level of reproduction. But these other mechanisms of evolution do not necessarily lead to a population that is better adapted or is more likely to reproduce, right? So I hope that that was something that was a little clear from what we said about these changes in allele frequencies in populations. It can be due to randomness, right? That's a random aspect of how evolution can take place. It can be due to movement from one area to another, and often these go together. Um, and that changes the gene pools of populations. So gene flow is, right, when you have these populations, and I put this figure up that was after the founder effect figure, where we see if we have these islands and these islands are isolated from each other, that you can have a group of individuals from a mainland population and they can get out to an island and become isolated on the island. This happens with humans all the time. It's happened a lot in human history, where a group of people get on a boat or a few boats and they go and they leave the continent or the area that they're from, and they go and they settle on a remote island somewhere and they start a population on that island, and they don't have the same genetic variation that the island or that the mainland population has. But if an individual were to travel from one of these populations to another and settle in that population, or even travel from one to another and mate with somebody in the other population, leaving gametes behind, then that changes the genetic composition of those individual populations as well. And that's gene flow. And that leads to evolution of those populations because it leads to a change in the gene or the allele frequencies of those populations. So another way to think of that is like Channel Islands. I didn't really talk to you guys about Channel Island foxes, but they evolved from a mainland fox species that a few individuals got washed out to the islands, and on those islands they had different selective pressures, and the pressure was to be smaller because of a smaller resource base. This also happened with mammoths several thousand years ago, somewhere between about 2 million and 12,000 years ago, got washed out to the Channel Islands and evolved into a smaller species of mammoth on that island because of natural selection, selecting for different traits. So there was natural selection, but also when they got washed out there, there was genetic drift because they only had a certain number of alleles with them when they landed on that island. They were small populations, so they probably lost alleles. And we don't know the extent to which there may have been new individuals coming and going if there were opportunities to travel from island to island or from island to mainland. So that if there were opportunities to travel, that would be gene flow. And all of these affect the genetic composition of populations. And I think the most challenging concept of all of this personally is genetic drift because it's randomness. But yeah. Do you all understand how mutations and sexual reproduction are important to variation? I know we touched on that a minute ago. Did you understand this example about the veg heads? So I like to think of it, if you had a kit and your kit had all these different head shapes in it and all these different nose shapes and all these different eye shapes, that kit is all of that's your gene pool for the population, right? These are all the different options in the population with respect to alleles. And the only way to get a new addition to that kit is for a mutation to have occurred at some point, right? So if there's a mutation, you might get a different nose shape to put into your kit, and that's just part of your gene pool. A mutation can add alleles to the gene pool and provide that initial source of variation. So mutation is the initial source. And then sexual reproduction is all about how those traits get put together into one individual. So that's where if you had all of these different parts laid out across your floor, you could say, okay, this head and these eyes and this nose and these ears. And we don't get to choose during reproduction, but it happens randomly that you get this assortment of all these traits coming together in one individual. And it's because of sexual reproduction that you have a population full of individuals, and all of them are unique. All of them are a unique combination of traits. So that's another form of genetic variation, is the suite of traits, you might say, right? Each one of us represents a suite of traits. We are all of us put together. And that's another thing that natural selection acts on. It's kind of fun to think about variation in a population with respect to natural selection, because there might be a trait that works well for one individual that doesn't work well for another individual because of the other traits that they have. So certain physical structures that you might have combined with the behaviors that you're likely to do, those combinations of traits are what natural selection acts on. So it's pretty interesting to think about that. All right. Any other questions?
I had a question about his or Charles Darwin.
Yes.
One of the number 4, it said what was his major contribution to biology. Was that his theory of evolution?
Yes. So Charles Darwin, what you should know with respect to him is his the two main parts of the book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And those two main components were, I'll get to them in the slides, that all species on Earth are evolutionary related. So every species present evolved from a single ancestral species. So he talked about the relatedness of life on Earth, that all species today descended from a common ancestral species. And there were these small modifications, which we now know as mutations, right? These mutations could accumulate, and if you give it enough time, these small changes in what we now know as genetics can lead to these massive changes in the structure of organisms. Okay, so that was his first. This is the slide that says it all. Species living today descended from a single ancestral species, that first species of life, which was bacterium, right? Most likely from all the evidence that we have. There's a lot of evidence for this. We know a lot more now than Charles Darwin knew. Like, we know about the genetic code, and that if you put DNA from a human into a bacterium, that bacterium will make the same protein that a human would make from that DNA. So we all use these same mechanisms for making proteins. There's a lot of evidence for this unity and this connectedness and relatedness. And then Darwin, he had this idea of change over time with respect to life. He was struggling because he couldn't explain how it happened, and he was not going to publish anything until he had all of his ducks in a row and was able to explain this is how evolution occurs. And he did, and he explained natural selection. And that was the big part of that book on the origin of species. So the fact that evolution occurs, the relatedness of species, and the process occurring through the mechanism of natural selection. And then I mentioned in the lecture, he also went on later to publish a book about sexual selection. So a famous idea from Darwin is that, or a quote is that he said, "The sight of a peacock makes me sick. the sight of a male peacock made him feel ill because he couldn't explain it earlier on in his life. Why would a bird have such a fancy decorative tail? It didn't make sense with respect to survival, but then he got it, right? It makes sense with respect to reproduction. And reproduction is how you pass your genes on to the next generation. You do not pass on your genes just by surviving. So any trait that's going to have you live a really, really long life but never reproduce is a trait that's not going to get passed on by you to the next generation. So reproduction is really a key to this natural selection. I went beyond there, Joshua. Just kept talking, but you got the gist, right?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Do you all feel like you have a handle on natural selection? I hope the Darwinian snails helped you out a little bit. I hope that you can tell it as a story. And of course, the way that our exams are set up, we don't have a lot of opportunities for storytelling right now. But what I want to challenge everybody to do this week is explain natural selection to someone in your family or in your friend group or someone you interact with. Just explain to them how natural selection works and see if you can tell it like a story. You could start with something like I started with at the beginning of the lecture, where we talked about a population. You could just say, look at this population of birds, how do they vary? What's the variation within this population? You could talk about how not every individual is the same, that there are some, and this is heritable variation, it's genetic, right? It has to have a genetic basis. There has to be some mechanism in place here by which certain individuals are more likely to reproduce in this population than others are. And it's not random when we're talking about natural selection, it's based on their traits. So there are some traits that are going to provide an advantage in survival or reproduction. And those traits are more likely to get passed on to the next generation because the individuals who have them survive and reproduce. So in the next generation, what you're going to see is that the traits that favored survival and reproduction have been passed on more than others. And over time, the population is going to evolve so that these adaptive traits are more abundant in the population, that they are at a higher frequency and percentage, like we saw with the Darwinian snails, where the snails with the thick shells survived, so they got to reproduce, and you had a population that was changing over time toward an average thicker shell. So do that. And if you have any more questions, ask me. And if you don't, then we can wrap up this session. I don't need to keep you here any longer than you need to be here, but I want to make sure that all of your questions are answered. So is there anything else? Did you guys get the GMOs? I think I might do a little assignment next week because I'm trying to get you all these 10-point assignments sprinkled in. Those help bring up your grade. And I did one this week. It was a very easy 10-point assignment to get you thinking about evolution. So if you're watching this video or if you're right here, if you haven't done that 10-point assignment, do it now. It's very easy. And then you can keep doing it repeatedly if you didn't get your 10 points the first time. Any questions about GMOs? Okay, common misperceptions about GMOs is that it's dangerous to eat a food that has GMOs in it. We do not know any danger of that. As you saw in the lecture, it's nearly impossible to demonstrate no danger through experimentation, but there have been lots of experiments and no evidence has been shown that just eating a food that is genetically modified independent of what the food itself is harmful. But also there are misconceptions that we've been genetically modifying organisms for centuries and centuries through breeding of crops and so forth. And I will say that when we talk about GMOs in this biological context, we're not talking about selective breeding. We're talking about taking a gene from one individual or from one source, or taking genetic material from one source, and through biotechnology in a laboratory, inserting that genetic material into another source. The thing the naturally occurring thing that is most closely related to this would be like a virus coming into your body and inserting genetic material into your DNA. But this is done through biotechnology companies, and it raises a lot of questions about our own limits, what we want to do as a society. Any questions, folks?
I had a question about number 8.
Number 8. Why can't natural selection lead to perfect organisms? Good. Yeah, so what are your ideas on that? What's one reason that natural selection cannot lead to perfect organisms? I see there being two main reasons here that natural selection can't lead to perfect organisms.
Is
And
it
it goes, uh-huh.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say the question 7, I keep wanting to like use that to justify it, like how it's not goal oriented. So if it's not goal oriented, it's never gonna get to a goal of being perfect as one of them. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and actually both parts of question number 7 go together, I would say, to answer number 8. So let's
Okay.
start with this one. What does it mean that natural selection is not a creative process? And I see something in the Zoom here. Right. I see a few things about it being goal oriented and about existing variation. So let's put those two together. First of all, do you get new traits through the process of natural selection? Do populations or individuals get new traits through the process? No, they don't. So this is very important because you'll often hear people saying, okay, so there were some bears and they lived in a certain area, and then the climate changed and they all had brown fur, and then the climate changed. And imagine this scenario, haha, where it became colder. That's not happening. But so let's switch it around. Okay. There were bears and they lived in an area and it was polar and it was covered in snow, but then the climate changed and there was no more snow. And all the bears before had been white, but then the bears changed to brown so that they could blend into the background. So, no, that's not going to happen through natural selection. We don't have organisms changing in response to natural selection to get the traits that would be suited. But what you would need to have is existing variation in the population. So, if there were already some brown bears in that population, then those brown bears might have a selective advantage now. But you're not going to see creation of a new trait that's well adapted. So they're never going to be perfectly adapted to their environment because you're never going to get, a coat color that exactly blends into exactly where you are at that point in time. Um, there are historical constraints, right? We all have evolved from other species before our species. There is an ape species that was our ancestor, and way, way back there was a fish that was our ancestor, and way, way, way back there were bacteria. So we kind of are built on a body plan that is what was the best of what existed in our ancestors for a given environment. So that's the first thing. It doesn't create new traits. This is why we all have back pain, right? Is there a human on earth that doesn't have back pain at some point, in their lives? And it's because we evolved from organisms, first of all, that were in water with our skeletal systems. So there was buoyancy. But then after that, it was quadrupeds, right? We weren't moving around on two legs. And then humans come along and we start walking upright and we're bipedal. But our skeletal system, we didn't get a new spine when we started walking upright, right? We just had what we had left over. That was our existing trait. So if there were variations that were helpful in that environment, they would be selected for, but there's no creation of new traits. You're kind of stuck with what's already existing, and traits can be selected from what's already there. Secondly, even if you did get pretty well adapted to your environment, it's not perfect, right? But even if you were really well adapted, the environment always changes. So new pathogens come in, climate changes, and what's good in one environment is not necessarily going to be good in another environment. And that's what we mean by there's no goal, right? There's no goal, like the direction could shift like that. So you're not going to see perfectly adapted organisms.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
For 13, we said like mutations and gene flow
So
are, and I just wanted to make sure that we're like, because you said we're not getting new traits, but you did say like we were getting a new allele in this situation. But are we just, it's only that we're getting mutations in the population so that like the next generation has like a different one than the previous rather than a new trait, right?
hmm So yeah, thank you. This is a really good question. So let me back up and clarify for 13 here. Within a population, so we're not counting gene flow because gene flow is coming from a different population. But within a population, this is what's asking number 13, genetic variation in that population can come about through mutation. And mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation. That's
Mhm.
how we get new alleles. And through sexual reproduction within that population. So that just gives you different unique combinations of traits.
Okay.
Now, this is talking about mutation, whereas before, or what we were just talking about, is natural selection. And it's important to separate those two things because mutation is a creative process, right? Mutation does lead to something new, but it's random.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
So a mutation, I kind of give the analogy sometimes of think about a clock. What if you had a big kind of, if you know what a grandfather clock is, or just a big old mechanical clock that you have in your house, and it works, right? Is it perfect? I'm sure it's not, right? Everything is a compromise in some ways, but it works. What if you were to hit that clock with a hammer? You might change something about the clock, right? Would you probably make the clock work better if you just hit it with a hammer?
Mm, no.
No, right? You're probably, it maybe it just works the same, or odds are if you change it, you're going to make it work worse. Is it possible that by randomly hitting a clock with a hammer, you can make the clock work better?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. It's possible. So that's how I think about mutations. A mutation is a random change in your DNA sequence. And you, as an organism, you're functional, right? We're functional right now. But if you come in and just randomly change something about our DNA, and that would be a mutation, odds are that's either going to be neutral or it's going to hurt us in some way. But it's possible that if you come through and randomly change the DNA, it's possible you're going to end up with a trait that's like, oh, hey, that's a little bit better. So if you think about the history of life on Earth and all these mutations that have occurred, that's random. It is a creative process, but it's not due to natural selection. It is random. And most of the time, they're either neutral or they pop up in a population and get wiped out because they're harmful. But if there's a mutation that's good, like, oh, this organism has a spot on its wing, and that's a new trait, but that spot on its wing actually distracts predators in some way, then that's a new trait that can get passed on. And then there could be selection on that trait and make it more abundant in the population. So that's the difference, is natural selection is not creative, but you do have existing variation in a population, and that's what natural selection works with. And the amount of existing variation is related to mutations that have taken place in the past.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, I know you already went over it, but I still didn't really understand number 8.
Okay, number 8. Why can't natural selection lead to perfect organisms? Right, so let's just think about a perfect organism. If we were perfect, we would, I don't know, maybe not crave things that make us sick, right? And we have a history of evolution, and we have traits that are based on that history, and we can't get new traits because natural selection is not creative, right? So we can't just get a new trait because it would be good. In my example with the insects, and the flowers, sorry, I had red flowers and yellow flowers in a population, right? And I think I asked at the end, what would happen if a new pollinator came into this population and the pollinator would only visit purple flowers? Do you expect purple flowers to appear because this pollinator prefers purple? If the environment changes and the trait that would be perfect is not there, is that trait going to appear?
No.
No, right? It's not, because natural selection cannot create new traits, and it can't make the top speed that a human can run faster, right? Because we're constrained by our body mechanics with respect to how fast we can run. So maybe in certain environments, it'd be better if we could run 75 miles an hour, but we can't. So we have constraints on our body forms because we descended from other species and we have what we have. You can only, natural selection only tinkers with existing variation, right? So if you have a dog population, a group of dogs, and you want a dog that's pink with purple polka dots on it, if there's not a pink dog in that population, you can't select a pink dog, right? You can select a black dog or a white dog or a brown dog or any of the variation that's there, you can select from that variation, but you can't select something that's not there. So that's one reason natural selection doesn't lead to perfect organisms, because it has to select from what's available in the population. It's not a creative process. And even
Okay,
if
thank
it
you.
were, even if it were a creative process, the environment always changes. So it's not, you can't get perfection. Even if you did, the environment always changes. And there's a famous evolutionary biology line using the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland that says populations have to evolve as quickly as they can just to stay where they are, which is because of all the pathogens and parasites that are introduced. So you might not realize it, but the environment's constantly changing, even with respect to what you're being challenged with. And a suite of traits that works in one environment might not work in a different environment. So we don't get perfect organisms. Was that clearer, Olivia?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Cool, folks. Just to give you an overview of what's coming up, we'll have our lectures next week. We'll do speciation and biodiversity. We'll look at classification and diversity. And then after that, we'll do ecology. We've got a week of ecology lectures. So there's this week of lectures, then the next week, and then the next week, and that's all your material for exam 3. So keep on with the review questions. For lab next week, it's going to be the 3rd Simutext lab, which is on keystone predators. So if you want to get started on that, you're welcome to. Make sure you've wrapped up the Darwinian snails lab by Sunday, and your evolution survey, the graded survey on what we know about evolution. Everybody good?
I actually had one more question about the exam. Do you know when you'll be showing us which questions or like releasing the answers or what we got wrong?
Right. I think I can actually do that by today or tomorrow. I'm just going to go in and make sure that the couple of people who were taking it a little bit later, that they've wrapped all of that up.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Do you have access to your questions from your last exam and the answers and all that? Let me know if there's something, as the semester progresses, there are so many assignments. I have a hard time kind of keeping track of what's open and not. So if you're ever trying to get your access to the questions and your answers and the correct answers, and you think they should be up there, then please send me an email too and say, hey, I can't see my answers on this one, so I can make sure to go in and open it for you. And I'll be doing that for the exam today or tomorrow. The grades are much better from the ones I've been looking at, much better than exam 1 for all the ones I've graded so far. So hopefully that trend continues. All right, folks, I'm going to say goodbye.
Okay, thank you.
Unless there are other questions. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Have a good Thursday. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.